Have you ever had one of those bizarre dreams where, for a moment, you wake up and you're not sure if you're still dreaming? Maybe you look around your room or look at your hands, and they don't seem quite right. But what if that feeling lasted beyond a dream? What if one day you woke up and realized you weren't human anymore? That's the exact scenario in Franz Kafka's famous short story, The Metamorphosis. In it, Gregor Samsa, a traveling salesman, wakes up one morning to find himself transformed into a gigantic insect. His body is now that of a giant, grotesque bug, with legs and a hard shell. And here's the twist. This isn't the stuff of nightmares or fantasy. Kafka presents it as an ordinary day, except for the fact that Gregor is now utterly and horrifyingly different. But Gregor's metamorphosis isn't just about him turning into a bug. It's a deep exploration of the nature of identity, family, and society. So, let's dive into this strange world and try to make sense of what Kafka is really telling us. Chapter 1. Gregor's first morning as an insect. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that your entire body has changed. That's how Gregor feels when he wakes up in his bed. Not only late for work, but also unable to move his limbs like he used to. Gregor's first reaction to his new situation? It's not to panic or cry out for help. No. Gregor's first thought is, I'm late for work. The man, who has just turned into a huge bug, is still worried about his job. He's terrified that he will lose his job if he doesn't show up on time. And this reveals a lot about Gregor's life before the transformation. Gregor works tirelessly as a traveling salesman. He's the main breadwinner in his family, providing for his mother, father, and younger sister, Greta. This responsibility weighs heavily on him. So when he's late for work, he thinks only about the consequences for his family. He even feels guilty about taking the time to figure out how to move with his new insect body because, in his mind, he must keep working. This obsession with work, with productivity, and with being needed is what Kafka is trying to highlight here. Chapter 2. The family's reaction. When Gregor's family realizes something is wrong, they react with confusion, fear, and ultimately, disgust. His mother calls through the door, concerned, and Greta knocks anxiously, wondering what could be delaying Gregor. But when Gregor tries to explain, his voice comes out as an unrecognizable series of hisses and clicks. He can't speak the way he used to. And here's the first twist in the story. His family is terrified. Not because they're worried about Gregor, but because they're scared of what he has become. When they finally open the door and see him, they react with shock and repulsion. His sister Greta, who initially tries to care for him, is appalled. Their father, on the other hand, is furious, and their mother faints. No one is asking how he feels. No one is asking why this is happening to him. They are only concerned with how this new Gregor fits into their lives, or rather, doesn't fit. For the first time, Gregor feels alienated, even by his own family. The people who were supposed to love him unconditionally now see him as nothing more than a monster. Kafka's point here is powerful. When we stop being able to fulfill our roles or expectations in society, we are no longer seen as human. Instead, we are rejected, even by the people closest to us. Chapter 3. The slow, painful isolation. After the initial shock wears off, Gregor's family begins to treat him less like a person and more like a burden. His sister Greta, who once tried to help him, soon begins to withdraw. She continues to bring him food, but she no longer looks at him the same way. Her care for him becomes more mechanical, something she has to do rather than something she wants to do. Eventually, Gregor is locked away in his room, isolated from the rest of the family. As the days pass, Gregor begins to lose track of time. His room becomes filthy, and he grows weaker. The food that Greta brings him is no longer his favorite, but she insists on feeding him the same things. It's clear that Gregor's family is no longer interested in his well-being. They just want him out of the way. This is the beginning of Gregor's total isolation. He begins to see himself less as a human being and more as the thing his family views him as, a problem that needs to be dealt with. But the real question is, why doesn't he fight back? Why doesn't he try harder to communicate with his family? Kafka doesn't give us a clear answer, but perhaps it's because Gregor has been conditioned by society, by his role as a worker and provider, to believe that his worth is based on what he can give others. Now that he's no longer useful, he no longer has a sense of self. He has lost his identity. Chapter 4. Rejection and Betrayal. The moment when Gregor's father decides to physically hurt him marks the turning point in the story. In a fit of rage, Gregor's father throws an apple at him. The apple doesn't just hit him, it gets lodged in his body and creates a deep wound. This moment is deeply symbolic. The apple is often a symbol of knowledge or temptation. But here, it represents something much darker: rejection, violence, and the rejection of Gregor's humanity. It's hard to ignore the parallels between Gregor's situation and the ways society often treats those who are no longer able to contribute. When someone loses their job, becomes ill, or can't fulfill their expected role in society, they often find themselves abandoned, neglected, or even punished. Much like Gregor, his father's attack on him is a metaphor for how society often casts aside those who are seen as unproductive or useless. Chapter 5. The Ultimate Betrayal. As Gregor's physical condition deteriorates, his family's treatment of him grows worse. At first, his sister Greta cared for him, but over time, even she begins to resent him. She grows tired of the burden Gregor has become. She decides, with the encouragement of their father, that they need to get rid of him once and for all. This is the moment Gregor realizes that his family no longer sees him as human. They no longer see him as a son, a brother, or even as Gregor. To them, he's nothing more than a nuisance. His transformation has rendered him disposable. This is where Kafka's critique of family, society, and the human condition becomes most powerful. Gregor is not just rejected because of his outward appearance. He's rejected because he can no longer fulfill his role as a provider. Greta, who once loved him, now sees him as nothing more than a monster. She even goes so far as to suggest that they lock him away forever. The family's betrayal is heartbreaking, but it's also incredibly telling about the way society values individuals based on their usefulness. Chapter 6. Gregor's Final Moments. As the days pass, Gregor grows weaker and more disillusioned. His family no longer provides for him. They no longer visit him or check on him. They've given up. In a final act of despair, Gregor decides to stop eating. He no longer has the will to fight, the will to live. It's as though, in the absence of love and care, he gives up his desire to survive. In the end, Gregor dies. And when his family finds him dead, they don't mourn. They don't grieve. Instead, they feel relief. They're finally free of the burden Gregor became. And what's even more chilling is that within hours, they begin to make plans for their future. They take a walk in the park, discussing what they'll do now that Gregor is gone. They move on as though nothing ever happened. Chapter 7. The Deep Message of the Metamorphosis. So, what's the point of the metamorphosis? Why did Kafka write this story about a man who turns into a bug only to be rejected by his family? At its core, the metamorphosis is a critique of the way society treats individuals who are no longer seen as valuable. It asks uncomfortable questions about how we define ourselves and how others define us based on our productivity. Kafka is asking, what happens when we lose our identity? When we can't fulfill the roles society expects us to play? How do we cope with rejection and the dehumanization that often follows? Gregor's transformation into a bug is not just a physical one. It's symbolic of how society sees people who can no longer contribute. It's a commentary on the emptiness of a society that values individuals based on their utility rather than their inherent worth as human beings. Why the metamorphosis still matters. Kafka's The Metamorphosis isn't just a weird, surreal story about a man who turns into an insect. It's a profound examination of identity, family, and society. It forces us to ask tough questions about what happens when we stop being useful, when we stop fitting in, and when we're no longer seen as valuable. In today's world, where success is often measured by what we achieve, how we look, or what we can provide, the metamorphosis is a haunting reminder of what happens when we're pushed aside, when we lose our value in the eyes of others. And maybe, just maybe, Kafka is telling us that we need to rethink how we treat those who are struggling, those who are different, and those who are no longer able to contribute. The next time you read The Metamorphosis, think about the people in your life who might be struggling, the ones who might not fit in. Are we treating them like Gregor Samsa's family treated him? Or are we seeing their value beyond what they can give us?